Hello, this is Phil Cornish. I am your host for Cornish Talks Common Sense, and we are back for some more programs in 2023. We're going to start with this topic. What is in store for the economy in 2023? Are we heading for a recession? Is there going to be more inflation? What do governments have to do with it? Let's come back in a minute and talk about this subject. Welcome back. I told you just a moment ago that the topic I'm going to deal with today is the economy. That's been a concern for a lot of people coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a topic that is a concern for people financially, for their financial well-being, and so it's an important subject to consider. So I want to take a little bit of time today to talk about where we're heading and what, if anything, can we expect and what can we do about it. So the concern coming out of COVID-19 and the pandemic has been inflation. We've seen inflation grow to heights that we haven't seen for a lengthy period of time, really around the world. Right now in Canada, our rate of inflation has come down a little bit to around 5% at this moment. In the United States, it's still a little bit elevated from that. And in the United Kingdom, it's still over 10%. And there are other places in the world where it's even higher than that. So inflation obviously means more cost for us for gasoline in our vehicles, groceries, other living expenses, housing, and so on. And it has become a burden for people. We're hearing how individual debt has been increasing. People are putting more money on their credit cards, and mortgage costs are higher for people now. So why did this happen? Why did we get to a point where inflation has risen? Well, we need to understand, first of all, that inflation is a normal cyclical pattern that happens. We have not had inflation in North America now for some time, more than a couple of decades since we've really had some real inflation. The reason why inflation has been kept low really relates to government monetary policy that has been in place now since at least the mid 2000s and the last economic downturn, really probably 2008, 2009, because inflation has been artificially low because the bank rates have been artificially low. Historically, over time, the fluctuation of interest rates has extended into double digits. When I was growing up, interest rates were hovering between 10 and 15% in the 1970s. We haven't seen that kind of inflation since that time, and it's because there's been a directed monetary policy to keep interest rates low. Why? What is the benefit of that? Well, governments and the monetary policy makers in Canada, the Bank of Canada, and in the United States, the Federal Reserve, have wanted to keep business thriving and the economy growing. And the way they have seen fit to do that is to keep interest rates hovering just a little bit above zero so that people will be induced to borrow more, to spend more, and that has led to our economy being relatively flourishing in the last decade, certainly. But it was an artificial, engineered policy that created that. And it certainly was something that was not going to go on forever. And so a crux happened when the pandemic caused a shutdown of a lot of businesses, and the government threw money in benefit programs that caused the money supply to grow significantly. How did that happen? Well, there are some statistical studies that have shown that many people's income actually grew coming out of COVID rather than shrank, because government benefits were so generous that incomes actually increased for many. And so what then was the effect of these excessively generous government policies? Well, we've seen a few things happen, and let me talk to you about a few of those. So in Canada, we know the CERB program was the primary one. There were employer benefits, and then there were individual employee benefits. But the main program I'm going to talk about is the CERB program. And so what we found in Canada was that the CERB program cost taxpayers $211 billion that the government sent out to people in government benefits. Well, how did that go? Well, what we find out now that out of that $211 billion in benefits, a significant sum, in fact, turns out to have been taken fraudulently. Something in the range of $4 to $5 billion was overpaid to ineligible persons. And so considerable fraud occurred as a result of the CERB program because of the mismanagement of that program by the federal government and the lack of accountability. So that, in turn, has only grown the federal deficit and debt like it has not been before. And we touched a little bit on that issue of the debt and the deficits in recent years in an earlier program. But let me just take a minute just to recapture some of that. So in Canada now, the federal debt is hovering around $1 trillion, a little bit more than $1 trillion. The debt is rising. The interest on the debt is increasing at $6 million per hour. And the average debt, if we were to look at it on a per capita basis of how much every Canadian would owe based on the federal debt obligation, it would be over $30,000 per individual. Now, this kind of debt, I'm going to suggest, is unsustainable, and especially if interest rates are increasing, the cost of that borrowing is going to be something that is going to become unmanageable, and it is going to cost taxpayers and Canadians severely due to what I would suggest is federal mismanagement. What else has happened with the federal government in particular in terms of the management of the economy as we're getting into 2023? Well, right now as we're filming this program, the federal public servants have just gone in strike, and I understand something like 155,000 federal employees are on strike. And I want to talk a little bit about what the public sector has created in terms of government debt and the inability of the federal government to manage its affairs in a fiscally sound way. So I have some statistics with me that talk a little bit about what's happened with the public sector in recent years. So let me talk to you about a few of those points. So I have one article with me that says this. It says nearly 9 out of 10 Canadian jobs in 2020 and 2021 were in the public sector. So in other words, of all new jobs that have been created, 9 out of 10 of those are government jobs, not private jobs, government jobs. These are jobs that cannot be sustained by government. The cost of them is inordinate and is fiscally irresponsible. And we add to that the fact that in 2021, 2022, 90% of federal public sector executives received $190 million in bonuses. $190 million in bonuses. Based on what criteria? Based on what kind of good work supported these bonuses? This kind of crazy pay to the public sector is costing taxpayers. It is not something that is fiscally responsible. So what needs to happen is the public sector needs to be reduced dramatically. There are too many government employees. I have other statistical information with me today that says that the productivity of government has not increased. In other words, you've got a growth of public sector employees at hugely elevated numbers, but they're not creating any greater productivity in the work that they're doing for that money. And now we're finding that most of them, having been permitted to work remotely for a while, want to continue working from home, where their accountability and measure of productivity can't very accurately be assessed. These kinds of irresponsible employer policy by the federal government just cannot be supported. More generally, even beyond the federal government, I've got another article with me that talks about 1.3 million workers in Ontario are employed by the public sector. That's almost 19% of all employees working either for municipal, provincial, or federal governments. That is astonishing to understand that there are that many employees. And just not long ago, they published what they call the Sunshine Lists. In Ontario, they publish all provincial employees who are making more than $100,000. And actually, I should include also municipal and county level employees as well. And in the 2022 year, the last year and the last report we have of this data shows that over 266,900 people were making more than $100,000 a year. And that's up significantly from the prior year and has reached its highest level. People, by and large, do not understand the level of public sector employment that taxpayers have had thrust upon them by governments who are not acting in a responsible fashion. And there is no choice but to reduce those public sector workers. We are not going to be able to support that kind of payment. And indeed, it simply has become overextended beyond any reasonability. Let me talk about one further area of government spending beyond employee pay in the public sector. We also know that despite this growth in the public sector workers, that the federal government in particular has paid more than ever before to consultants. There have been recent articles in the paper. I have one of those with me today as well, just from earlier this year, that describes the contracts that the federal government has with McKinsey and Company, one of the larger consulting firms, and the amount that we pay to McKinsey for consulting is astonishing. This article says the following. It says, but the McKinsey contracts are a drop in the bucket compared to the Trudeau government's overall use of consultants, which has increased to an estimated $17.7 billion. And that's compared to $10 billion when the present federal government took over in 2015. So a $7 billion increase there and up to nearly $18 billion in consulting fees. Why should this be necessary, that we have an increase in public sector employees and they apparently can't get all the information required to make decisions, so that we have to hire consultants beyond that for excessive amounts that are now nearing the $20 billion mark. These kind of expenditures could never be maintained by a private business. They would go bankrupt. And it's time that people, taxpayers, you and I, understand that this kind of debt load is perilous and something that simply cannot carry on. I want to just finish by talking about another area of government spending. We all know how the Trudeau government has introduced carbon tax. It's increased our gas prices, and there are other areas where cost has been unleashed on the public as well. And so this is in response to the specter of climate change. We've talked about that in prior programs that I've done, and I've suggested that climate change has been elevated to a secular religion and has carried on a weight that is far beyond what government is attributing to it. And we need to understand that the notion that man is capable of controlling all of nature and that we can simply spend money to fix nature and reduce the consumption of fossil fuels and reduce the carbon emissions, I'm going to suggest to you that is simply wrong-headed. And I have some articles as well today that talk about how that the government spending on climate change and carbon emissions is simply is not working. I have another article with me that talked about how that the diminishing of the carbon emissions has been negligible. For example, from 2020 to 2021, the carbon emissions changed by only 2.8%. In 2021, they were 691 million tons, and 2020, 672 million tons. So for all the money that's being thrown at climate change and carbon emissions, the benefit has been negligible. And I predict it will be going forward. It will be a sinkhole, a drain of government resources and money because of the hubris that federal governments have in believing that they can control the climate and make the kind of changes by the policies that they've implemented that will benefit the planet in a way that is meaningful. We've talked in prior programs about climate change, and I'm not going to get into that part of the debate today. I've suggested in the past it's been elevated to a greater height than what is appropriately warranted, and we need to just be careful about the amount of spending that's undertaken on that, especially when it effectively is doing almost no good. And the same as that is also the whole idea of money that's being spent to supposedly reduce landfill sites and reduce the amount of garbage and the consumption that occurs in our economy that leads to disposable goods. We're told that we're saving landfill space, and we're doing that by recycling. But then what you find out is that the reality is, as some documentary programs have told us recently, that a lot of our garbage that was supposed to be recycled is actually ending up in the Philippines and other foreign countries where it's literally been shipped in containers containers to foreign countries. That's what's happened to our recyclables. I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous, and we're being told and sold a bill of goods that recycling is actually working, when in fact all we're doing is moving it from one location to another. And even beyond that, the amount of damage that's being done to the oceans and so on has been remedied only minimally. So the work that's being undertaken by promised goals of fixing our climate and reducing garbage has been a bill of goods that we've been sold. And again, our governments are substantially responsible for creating these falsehoods. I'm going to summarize just by saying this. Look, we need to be vigilant about what happens with our governments. We need to exercise care and careful analysis and study and accountability of what is happening under the specter of these mandates for dealing with our economy more generally and other subsets of the economy with respect to climate change goals and recycling and other programs. We need to become aware and alert to these problems. It is only going to grow worse. We need to take meaningful steps to make changes. I hope this information has been helpful to you. Thanks for joining me today.